Okay, I think we're going to get started with the next panel, the effects of marriage inequality on lesbian and gay men. And I'm very excited about the panel. I've had a chance to look over the papers and the projects. Some very exciting stuff looking at the impact of marriage equality on a broad range of social behaviors and life experiences. So rather than keep you in suspense, I think we should just jump right in. I'm Corey Fields. I don't know what to from. I'm Corey Fields. I'm in the sociology department here at Stanford. And that's just how important these papers are that I don't want to really talk about myself. No, so seriously, thanks for coming out. And it's going to be a great panel. So we're going to go in order of the program. So I think we're just going to jump right in with Ellen Riggle, who's going to be presenting a paper called Marriage Magic, the Impact of Discourse and Law on LGBT Well-Being.
Change the title to something slightly less predictable. I want to begin where I think all good discussions of well-being and marriage equality should begin, and that's in the second grade. And so I want to begin with a little story. In April of this year, Sherry and I, it's my co-author, Sherry Rostosky, we're in New York City visiting a K-8 independent school to do some workshops with teachers and talk with parents about supporting positive LGBTQ identity development for youth. And we had the opportunity to do some Q&A with the 6th and the 7th graders and to do a little activity with the 2nd grade. Now, we'd been told that they talk about LGBT issues all the time at this school, and so we'd been told that they knew in general what LGBT means. But when I was introducing this activity about revealing things about ourselves that other people can't see, I said LGBT, and they looked just a little quizzical. So I said, "Do you know what lesbian means?" And they all smiled and said, "Yeah, they have a couple of lesbian teachers." Okay. "Do you know what gay means?" "Oh, yeah, they have an older schoolmate who's come out as gay, and they have a gay male teacher." "Do you know what bisexual means?" So I figure we're going to leave that talk about bi-invisibility for later in life. And I'm feeling pretty confident about my ability to be age appropriate in explaining what bisexual means to a 2nd grader. So I said it means a boy who might like a girl or might like another boy, or a girl who might like a boy or a girl. And they're all smiling and nodding yes, and we go on and do the activity, and it's all good. Until the end of the class period, when Sherry, who's the real psychologist here and teaches lifespan development, leans over to me and says, "You realize at this developmental stage, they all like boys and girls." So effectively, I just told them all they're bisexual. While it's probably not accurate, I figure they're going to figure that out. So that night at dinner with the principal of the school and the director of K through 2, we told them this story, and they laughed like, "Yeah, that happens." And I turned to the primary grade director, and I said, "Okay, Catherine, how do you explain bisexual to a 2nd grader?" And she said, "Oh, that's easy. I tell them it's a boy who might marry a girl or might marry another boy, or a girl who might marry a boy or a girl." And I'm like, "Marry? That's the key?" And she's like, "Yeah." She said, even though a lot of them have parents who are not married for one reason or another, they still get that word as some kind of special relationship. It's like Edie Windsor had said a few weeks before leaving the oral arguments at the Supreme Court. It's a magic word. So how do we as social scientists study the impact of a magic word on well-being? Well, it's a puzzle, and we have to put together a lot of pieces over time to see how it works. Now, researchers have obviously been studying the impact of marriage on well-being. I know where I'm going to put those. For men and women and different sex couples for decades now. And they're still trying to piece together a complete picture of what's really a somewhat moving target. So today I want to present a couple of pieces of the puzzle from our research, and I want to make 2 points. One, we typically focus on negative indicators of distress, but we need to also be looking at positive indicators of well-being when we study the impact of marriage on individuals. And second, we need to look at both state and trait indicators of well-being in order to assess the full impact of marriage equality in both the short and the long term. So we've conducted a series of studies that I'm going to draw on from here today. Just briefly, we conducted a series of quantitative and qualitative surveys back in 2006 around the marriage restriction amendments. We also conducted a companion survey with parents and family members of LGBT individuals. I'll reference that in a minute. We've also done interviews with over 100 same-sex couples over the past decade on a variety of topics, and we just completed a survey of positive identity with LGBTQ individuals last year. So I'm not going to go into any detail about any of these studies. If you are interested, you can look up some of our published work and information about all this online. What I want to do is use some of the results from this to make our points. So I'm going to hit some highlights, talk about some trends. Now, one way to look at the impact of marriage magic is to look at the symptoms of psychological distress, or as some might call them in a very oxymoronic way, negative indicators of well-being. You'll see why I say that in a moment. Because of the tendency that we have as social scientists to ask about and, in fact, to get money for studying because we want to fix things, right? So we study pathologies and distress. That means that there have been some studies already of the impact of psychological distress caused by marriage inequality, or even a couple of studies now about the alleviation of distress that's caused by marriage equality, right? And all of this research is just beginning. I want to give a couple of examples from our work. In 2006, we studied the impact of marriage restriction debates and found, not surprisingly, that having a marriage restriction amendment on the ballot exposed LGBT respondents to more negative messages about LGBT individuals and same-sex couples, and that created what we like to call a hostile environment, which was then associated with higher levels of psychological distress. For example, the more proximal those negative messages were, the more that increased, or the more impact that had by increasing distress. And this was also true, by the way, for family members of LGBT individuals. And this nice chart is just to show you that we can do the numbers, but I have prettier pictures. We also, in those studies, found reports of perceived stress and depressive symptoms decreased when respondents were in a civil union, domestic partnership, or civil marriage, as compared to being single or in a committed relationship, and that would be on your right. That's the far right column, the legal column there. And that held regardless of whether the state a respondent lived in recognized their legal relationship, and that's that NR, that's that third column, NR legal. And what's important here is that the slope of that bar is going down, which means that there's a decrease in reports of psychological distress by relationship status. Now, more recently, we found that being in a civil marriage is associated with lower reported levels of depressive symptoms, less need for acceptance, which is a good thing, and what I call unauthenticity, and this is one of those great examples of negative indicators of well-being because it's being not authentic. The questions are all, and I'll talk about authenticity in a moment, but all these questions are about how not authentic you are, right? It's a good thing to be not authentic. Never mind. I still have a hard time with all that. So now, more recent, and all of this was true regardless of whether the person lived in a state that recognized their civil marriage equality. Now, so for individuals, the magic seems to be in the word, right? But we are not in any way arguing, of course, that states don't need to recognize marriage equality, and I'll give you a good example of why in a moment. So now let's turn to another view of the magic. Positive well-being and psychological distress, or these negative indicators of well-being, are not two ends of the same vector. They are different creatures that, in very important ways, have different impacts on psychological health and well-being. So we need to also be looking at these measures of positive well-being in order to get a more complete picture of the impact of marriage. So why is positive well-being important? Isn't it just enough to not feel bad? Well, I think most of us can answer that in a very intuitive way. No. Right? And psychological studies would back us up. Not feeling bad is good, but in the end, it's just one part of feeling good. Even if we don't suffer from pathologies, we may still lack what's called a zest for life. What we really want in order to feel really good is to flourish, and flourishing is that extra good feeling. It's a feeling of having meaning and purpose in our life. It's a feeling of being creative. It's a feeling of being connected to others. It's a feeling that we are growing and that we are engaged in life. When we're flourishing, we tend to be more satisfied with our life, and more importantly, we are better able to handle any challenges that do come our way. And that's a term that we use the term resilience often when we're talking about that. And that resilience can lead to overall better psychological and physical health in both the short and the long term. Now, we've looked at several positive well-being measures in our work, and these are measures that don't get used as often when studying the impact of marriage equality. First, in 2006, we found that being in a civil union or domestic partnership, and even more so being in a civil marriage, was positively associated with an increased sense of meaning in life. And this was true regardless of whether or not a person lived in a state that recognized their marriage. We also looked at reports of perceptions of social support from others around us. And here we found that expected positive association between being in a civil union, domestic partnership, or civil marriage with feeling social support from those around us. But as you can see, they perceived less social support if they lived in a state that did not recognize their legal relationship. So based on these measures and some of our other work, we would argue that marriage has an intrinsic value for individuals and same-sex couples, which shows up in measures like meaning. And we think that there are trends towards state recognition having an impact on the individual in these measures, but they're not significant, so we're not going there yet. But marriage equality, on the other hand, has an extrinsic value. And that marriage equality in a state sends a message that impacts the ecological environment and creates more social support that then the couple perceives, and that then leads to better well-being. Now, more recently, in our survey last year, we collected several different indicators of well-being, positive well-being. And I'm going to focus on two of the most important components of positive well-being for individuals: authenticity and belonging. First, authenticity here we measured as a feeling of knowing and understanding one's own LGBT identity and being able to express oneself genuinely in interactions with others. And authenticity was significantly greater for those in a civil marriage as compared to those in a committed relationship. Belonging here we measured as feeling a connection to others in the LGBT community and feeling visible and valued in that community. And once again, it was significantly greater for those in a civil marriage. Both of these, authenticity and belonging, are two very important components of psychological health and well-being. We also measured satisfaction with life, which is Diener's often used global measure of well-being, which was also significantly greater for those in a civil marriage. Now, for all of these measures, the positive association was there whether or not the state a person lived in recognized their marriage. For these measures of well-being, once again, the magic seems to be in the word, the meaning that it has for individuals and couples. So what do we take away from these numbers and the qualitative studies and interviews that we've done? The marriage is, as one of our respondents put it, it's different being married. I didn't think it would make any difference. After all, we've been together for 24 years. But it does feel different, just knowing that we're married now, even though our state doesn't recognize it. I can't explain it. It feels good. And that's the magic. It's something that sometimes is hard to explain, even when we're a part of the trick. We feel the impact. Now, our second point is that we tend to use measures of psychological states when we do this. And in part, that's because these are easier to measure short-term changes in. So the psychological distress measures that we were talking about earlier, those are what we call acute measures. They start out with instructions like in the past month or even in the past 2 weeks. And so those, and the measures of authenticity and belonging and life satisfaction that we used are those that tend to be more state-like in that they pick up on changes that come from an event such as being married. Now, having said that, we all know that one of the common limitations of doing research on the impact of marriage is that most of the data we have, like we've effectively used here, is cross-sectional. So we can't see the direct causality of an intervention like getting married, but these more state-like measures do help us start to look at trends, and they help us start to make an argument. Now, we would also argue that the long-term impacts of marriage equality need to be studied over time. Traits are harder to see changes in. It takes longer to see the changes. Long-term health impacts, as opposed to just symptoms and behaviors, will take longer to determine, just as they have in studying the impact of marriage on male-female couples. Right? One thing that we're particularly interested in looking at over time is the impact of marriage equality on what's called variously, but often, minority stress. Minority stress is the chronic stress that's caused by a culture stigmatizing an identity, and in this case, LGBT identities. And we would argue that minority stress tends to act more like traits because of the cumulative effects of stress over time. So it's going to take longer to find those changes in well-being. For example, if you've noticed, we did not include in here a measure of something that's pretty common to talk about, internalized homonegativity or internalized homophobia. And that's because IH, as an indicator of minority stress, seems to be more consistent than state-like. So it's something that may be activated, but it's something that we wouldn't necessarily find a change in. And that's because as part of chronic minority stress, it's a result of being taught, right, that non-heterosexual identities are unacceptable, something that most of us have been hearing and have internalized since, let's say, like the second grade. So it's going to take longer to see the impact of marriage equality on things like chronic minority stress. So let's go back to when we, or at least most of us in the room, were in second grade or before. We learned that marriage is a magic word. Most all of us also at that time learned that we were only allowed to marry someone of the so-called opposite sex. And that sent a powerful message to those of us who identify as LGBT. Now, on the one hand, it presented us with a great opportunity to develop our complex thinking skills. And on the other hand, it also presented us with some challenges that come from minority stress. But when thinking about those second graders that we were talking to in New York City, they're growing up in a much different context where they're being told that boys can marry boys and girls can marry girls. And that message is so different. And that message is one that we'll only see the full impact of in both states and traits in the short and long term, years, maybe even decades from now. Thank you. Oh. And this is our website where you can go to find out more information about the studies I was talking about.
I do. Thanks, Ellen. Great. Next up, we have Patrick Egan from New York University, who is going to be speaking to us today about gay political identity after marriage equality.
not a Mac person. How do I get to desktop?
There you go.
I just came out. I'm not a Mac person.
Your shame is noted.
Discriminating against that one.
Okay, good.
All right. Thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks to Gary and Jane for having me and all of us. This is such a great opportunity and a great conversation to be a part of. So I'm going to talk a little bit looking forward past the marriage equality debates that Jane so nicely laid out for us that have been taking place over the last few decades, and think a little bit about what's next for gay political identity. And I'm going to make the not altogether heroic assumption that full equality, in quotes, is within reach within about a generation. That is, federal discrimination protections, marriage rights, policies in schools and workplaces that essentially treat gay people the same as straight people. And in other words, we're looking at a United States that looks something like Massachusetts looks like right now. And that doesn't seem so far out of reach. The big caveat I should say is that I don't think that's true for transgendered rights, which I think the story is probably a lot slower and a lot less certain, unfortunately. And so what I'm doing here is focusing on LGBT political identity, not only for that reason, but also because of the well-known data limitations that we have for collecting representative samples of transgender folks. So what's interesting here, I think, if we think about American history, is that this is, of course, a path of political incorporation that's been experienced by a lot of quote-unquote minority groups over time. And as for the case for gay people, it's also the case that many of these groups, while they enjoy de jure equality, continue to experience varying degrees of stigma and discrimination. And so with all these groups, a couple of questions tend to arise in the wake of political incorporation, and I want to think about them with regard to gay people. Here I'm going to ask two questions. One, and again, these are questions that have been asked about all kinds of groups in American politics. Does group identity become more or less salient through political incorporation? And second, does group political cohesion, that is, voting distinctively, having distinctive attitudes and beliefs about politics, become less distinctive as a result? So, you know, another word for incorporation might be assimilation, and I think that is also undergirding the kinds of things I'm talking about today. So I'm going to explore these questions with nationally representative survey sample data on LGB identification and also LGB political attitudes. And I'll be saying gay to mean LGB back and forth throughout the talk. This is definitely a work in progress. I think it's a book project, so I'm really eager to hear what you find interesting and compelling and exciting. Hopefully there's something exciting you find as I go forward. So measuring gay identity, so let me start first with talking about group identity and the salience of group identity for gay people. So measuring gay identity is always going to be a little bit of a challenge, right? We've got social desirability bias, which makes people reluctant to disclose identities, behaviors, attitudes that might expose them to stigma. And for what it's worth, all the numbers I'm going to be talking about today come not just from nationally representative survey samples, but also through what are called computer-assisted self-interviews, where at least there's a modicum of privacy as the person, usually listening to headphones, answers questions on a laptop computer while the interviewer is either in the other room or across the room or something. Okay. But what's interesting is if we assume that this kind of bias is subsiding over time at the same rate for both reporting LGBT identity and reporting same-sex sexual behavior, we reach this really interesting conclusion, which is that LGBT identity is increasing, same-sex behavior is not. Okay? And I'm going to show you some data that I think pretty much back up this idea. So nationally representative sample surveys indicate that reporting of same-sex sexual behavior increased markedly in the 90s and then plateaued right around 2000. So this is data from the General Social Survey, which has been asking questions, as sociologists will do, about who you're having sex with, how long ago that happened, and how many sex partners you've had over the course of your lifetime. So the General Social Survey has been asking the sex of your sexual partners since 1988, and this is the percentage of sexually active adults reporting at least one same-sex sexual partner in the past year. Okay? And there you see a plateauing, which I think reflects not that people were having, the ascent is probably not that people were having more same-sex sex in the 90s compared to the 80s. I think that's probably reflecting some kind of social desirability bias that is subsiding over time. And what I read in these numbers is that it stopped subsiding. So we reached some sort of equilibrium level where the desire to disclose or the ability to disclose had sort of peaked. So just keep those numbers in mind, because what's interesting is that when we look at reporting of lesbian, gay, or bisexual identity, we're seeing this dramatic increase since then, okay? And in fact, over the last decade, our best guess is that the share of the American population identifying as LG or B has increased by 70%. Okay? That's a big number, right? Okay? So this is data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, known as NHANES. It's only ages 18 to 59, and it's designed to capture a lot of things about health, and in particular sexual health. The green and orange lines are the percent identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or, quote, something else. That's green, and orange is just LGB. And NHANES has been asking this to a representative sample survey, representative sample since 2000. And what's really amazing is just the leap right here from 2.9 to 4.9% of this population that is identifying as LG or B. So where's that increase coming from? Well, it's coming from those who came of age in Jane Schachter's second decade. Okay? So if we look at those who were born after 1981, that is, they turned age 21 after Goodridge, that is the group where we're seeing this huge leap in the share of people identifying as LG or B. And it suggests, not the biggest stretch, would be to say that the equilibrium share, that is, as everybody else catches up to this generation, could be a much bigger LGB population than is typically seen in sample surveys right now. Usually it's around 3-4%. We're looking at something that is 50, 60, 70% higher than most of where our surveys have been saying. Okay? So that's a pretty interesting thing. Here's the other thing that's happening, which is much of the increase comes from those reporting no recent same-sex partners, particularly women. Okay, so this is more data from NHANES. This is this is the share of Americans identifying as LG or B who report having at least one same-sex partner in the past year. And blue is guys, and pink are the ladies. And so we see that I know you have to reinforce some gender stereotypes at a conference on marriage equality. So you have these data, and we see the guys identifying as LG or B much more than the women in terms of among those having a same-sex partner in the past year. That relationship is entirely the opposite of those who do not report having a same-sex partner in the past year. Now, again, the y-axes are very, very different here, right? These are, on the left, we're looking at a range between 70 and 100%. On the right, we're looking at a range between 0 and 3%. But the key thing here is that women are more likely to identify as LG or B if they have not had a same-sex partner in the past year, and that number has significantly increased over the last. So that's just sort of a bunch of really interesting stuff that I don't think we've really been paying attention to. And it all has to have something to do with the kinds of political processes that we've been talking about today and over the next 2 days. So all of this suggests that gay identity may be becoming a more fluid identity as the changing political climate leads more Americans to describe themselves this way. One interesting question then becomes, how fluid is fluid? We can actually put this in context by looking at the steadiness or the persistence of LGB identity alongside of that of other groups in American politics, like ethnic, racial, religious, and other identities. How can we do that? Well, it turns out the General Social Survey has a panel, of a nationally representative panel, in which they asked, are you lesbian, gay, or bisexual twice, once in 2008 and once in 2012. So we can actually see if people who said they were gay in 2008 said the same thing 4 years later, which is pretty great. We've never been able to do this before. They also asked the same kinds of questions about race, religion, ethnicity, party ID, ideology, et cetera. Okay? And so this becomes a valuable, although not ideal for reasons that are up there on the slide, a source for studying gay identity. So what does that look like? Well, here are the data about LGBs. And 1 in 5 people identifying as LGB in 2008 did not do so in 2012. So that seems like a relatively unsteady kind of identity. But when you put it in perspective, it's actually really interesting. So you can do the same thing with things like, did you identify as Irish? Did you identify as Catholic? Did you identify as black? Okay. And what I do on this next graph is basically graph the persistence of all these identities in the panel survey. So LGBs are all the way on the right, and their persistence at 79% is the horizontal line, the green dashed line. All these other groups are arrayed on this figure in terms of their persistence of identity. And actually, I should say this is done with an estimation strategy that controls for within-person steadiness generally. So we're essentially controlling for the fact that some people may be more error-prone and remembering what they said in 2008 than 2012. And so this is controlling for these sort of fixed effects of unsteadiness. So what you see is that LGBT identity is certainly less persistent than religion and race, okay? But it's more persistent than ethnicity, class, or ideology, all right? So and again, this is, other folks have sort of studied this kinds of stuff in comparative context. We've never been able to put gay people in there, and now we can, which is kind of a nice way to think about this. So let's just keep that in mind as I now turn to the second part of this talk, which is thinking about group political cohesion for gay people, and asking whether gay people are likely to continue to express distinctive political attitudes and vote in distinctive ways as the issues of marriage equality, let's say, fall away. Let's say it becomes less salient as we now live in the utopia that is Massachusetts, and so are we still doing things like voting for Democrats? And one way to think about this is to think about two possible paths of political incorporation, one followed by Jews and one followed by white Catholics, right? This is data from the ANES. It's the percentage identifying as Democrat over the last 50 years. And you think about both of these groups facing a lot of stigma at one point in American history. They both become assimilated, and one takes one path which is much less distinctive than the other, right? So that's just sort of like an illustrative model of what we might do. One way we might think about this. So 2 points. Signs, I think, point to continued distinctiveness for gay people, and I think there's 2 reasons. The first is lesbians, gays, and bisexuals are Democrats not because the Democrats support gay rights. Okay? I'm going to show you lots of evidence indicating that regardless of where Democrats stand on gay rights, LGBs are still Democrats, and I'll show you that in a sec. Second, it's also the case that I can show you that LGBs are liberal on a whole range of issues that have nothing to do with gay rights, that put them squarely in on the left wing of American political attitudes. So let me quickly kind of walk you through the claims I'm making about this. So let's first just think about what's been happening over the last decade, which is that gay identity as a political concept or a political phenomenon has become hugely salient, right? So if you're a gay person, it's impossible to watch American national politics, as Jane was saying, to open up a newspaper without having your identity invoked in one kind of way in national political discourse, right? So what we would expect, if that were the case, and the Democrats are taking a side that was much more pro-gay than Republicans, is that you'd see this huge spike in the share of gay people identifying as Democrats, right? Doesn't that seem to make sense? Well, that's not the case. Here is data from the GSS, which is that same-sex partners data. It's imperfect, but still a measure over time of where of the attitudes of people who are more or less gay. And this is also data from, yeah, exactly. This is also data from the exit polls, which has been reporting LGBT identity since 1996 in a consistent way. They've actually been doing it farther back, but the question changed. I'm going to keep it from 96 on. So what you don't see is like a huge spike in identification as Democrat over this time when gay identity is being so highly salient. And this is just all of Americans as a comparison group. So when you do differences and differences, you really get no indication of a change over time. Here's another way to think about it, which is events raising the salience of gay identity, that is, the same-sex marriage ballot measures that appeared on all these state ballots, have also not driven LGBs into the Democratic Party. So this is just an indicator from the exit polls of whether you live in a state that has ever had a ballot measure. So the nice thing is that we've exit polls over time, and so they've interviewed people in states both before and after they had one of these measures on the ballot, right? So we can see if certainly these ballot measures, as Ellen was indicating, raise the salience of gay identity for folks, right, and make them depressed and all these other things, right? And we would expect, if this were a big issue keeping gay people as Democrats, that you'd see a big change in their Democratic Party identification after one of these ballot measures appeared, right? Well, so if you just look at group means in terms of the share of people identifying as Democrats, here on the left, states where such ballot measures have appeared, gay people are actually less likely to identify as Democrat. And perhaps that's not surprising because you've got red states who are more likely to have these ballot measures than blue states. But when you control for state fixed effects and year fixed effects, which actually gets at some of that red state, blue state distinction, you're still seeing actually a relationship that looks anything but like gay people being driven into the arms of the Democratic Party, right? So the general story here is that LGBTs support Democrats regardless of the party's record on gay rights. This is a diagram from a paper I published last year where the x-axis is just how much more supportive of gay rights the Democratic Senate candidate was compared to the Republican Senate candidate on the ballot. And this is exit poll data showing the percentage of the vote for the Democratic Senate candidate. Look, if gay people really cared about this issue, you'd expect a big sharp line going up that graph as the Democratic candidate is much more supportive. And what you have is just a big flat line. Okay? Gay people are not responding to whether the Republican is Arlen Specter or Ted Cruz. Doesn't matter. They're voting for the Democrat. Okay? So that's sort of one thing that I think makes me think that gay people are likely to stay Democrats regardless of how these issues evolve. One more thing, which is it turns out, as I was saying, that gay people are liberal on a whole range of issues that even when you take out gay issues from the American political agenda. So we're back to the GSS because they have this rich battery of questions about policy preferences, and so we can put gay people on a two-dimensional map of American politics for the first time. So here, just for example, these are the questions that the GSS asks about economic issues. Happy to talk about these in detail. Here are the questions they ask about social issues. Again, I've left purposefully gay rights off of this agenda, so sort of just to show that this is not driving the result. And you can generate factor scores for these two dimensions and then plot the means of these scores for a series of groups in American politics, much of the ones I showed you earlier, just to get a sense of where gay people fall among all these other groups, right? Okay. So, and I just want to, my advisor, Henry Brady, did something like this in 2001 with ANES data, and I'm just, as all good mentees do, following in the path of their advisors. So here is the map for racial groups. For example, African Americans are very liberal on economics and slightly liberal on social issues compared to other groups in American politics. Here we can add religion, and you can see religious groups are highly polarized on social issues, not so much on economic issues, so we have some face validity here. The opposite is true for self-designated class, which are polarized on economic issues and not so much on social issues, right? And here's the almost complete map, and we can add LGBs here. That is a 95% confidence interval on each of the two dimensions. And that puts gay people on the map at a place that they're more liberal on social issues than the typical Democrat, and almost as liberal on economic issues as a typical Democrat, right? So, you know, a lot of the story that we've been hearing is that, okay, once you give gay people marriage, they're going to go start voting on their own economic, self-interested, you know, I want marriage and low taxes, you know, that kind of thing. And what we're seeing here is that that's probably not the case, that gay people are actually firmly in this lower left-hand corner on both social and economic issues for the time to come. So just summing up, what I'm showing you today, and I'll continue to explore in this project, is that gay identity is rising in prevalence. It's becoming less attached to sexual behavior and is as persistent as any other identity, as many other identities in American politics. Gay people's loyalty to the Democrats has its origins far deeper than the Democrats' embrace of the gay rights agenda, and it suggests that that will persist as this issue becomes less salient. And then finally, signs point to the continued allegiance of gay people to this left liberal coalition in American politics over the time to come. Thanks.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah. Next up, coming to the stage, so to speak, Sherrill from Hunter College, and his co-author, Andrew Flores, UC Riverside and UCLA affiliations, and their talk is entitled Marriage and the Shifted Priorities of Lesbian, Gay Men, Bisexuals, and Transgender People.
Actually, yeah, there is. Andrew knows how to run it. That's why I'm not using it, so that's all right. I don't believe in that stuff. We have a revised title, like all good papers, which is From Freedom to Equality, Marriage and the Shifting Priorities of LGBTs. We want to thank Gary and Jane and everybody involved in organizing this symposium. It's an honor to be here and a pleasure to be here. And in a way, our paper is about pleasure and honor. It's about freedom and equality. And the big finding is that 10 years ago, we were worried about discrimination and violence, and now we're worried about getting married. And people see that as progress. We still worry about discrimination. We still worry about getting beat up, but we worry more about getting married. And that's a big finding. I first began to understand the importance of looking at the priorities of LGBT people back in 1972 when I did a study of leaders and followers in New York City's Gay Activist Alliance, which Ellen was good enough to publish in a book she co-edited. Briefly, I interviewed about 100 people who went to the weekly business meetings of the Gay Activist Alliance. And then on Saturday nights, they held dances with all the beer you could drink for $3 at that firehouse, which was the headquarters. And I interviewed a couple hundred of the people who went to the dances. And one night, after doing a big box full of questionnaires, I was standing outside of the firehouse around 3 in the morning, and this Trotskyite in the leadership sample, big hulking guy, peaked cap, mustache, walks up to this really humpy number in a Johns Hopkins T-shirt who is in the dance sample, and looks at him in his most revolutionary way, and he says, "I don't think I've ever seen you here before." And the kid from Hopkins looked up at him and said, "I usually don't come here. I go to the bars. I make out better there." And the Trotskyite said to him, "When you go to the bars, you give your money to the mob. When you come here, you give your money to the movement." And the kid looked up at him and said, "I don't care about the movement. I care about making out." And really, that big light went off in my head then, about priorities. And so anyway, 30 years later, Pat and I did a piece for Symposium in PS that Gary edited, in which we found that more LGBT people placed a high priority on non-discrimination and on protections against violence than they did on marriage equality. But we noticed that there was a shift, with younger people being more likely to say that marriage was an important issue. Well, it was generally not on the radar for older people. And we argued that this represented a generational shift in the priorities. The priorities of a new generation were emphasizing equality as opposed to freedom. And this is roughly the argument. In the Stonewall era, our focus was on being free. Free to meet one another on the street, free to meet one another in the bar, free to tell someone that you wanted to have sex with them, which was enough to shut a bar down in New York in those days, or get you arrested on the street. Free to have sex with one another, free to keep your job, be free from violence, to be able to walk on the street. And you think back, I'm going far from my field here, but as far as the Greeks, at least, and certainly through antebellum South, marriage and voting came with citizenship. People who were not free could not get married. Parenthetically, felon disenfranchisement and sodomy statutes, in fact, did prevent people from voting, which is something we don't talk about. So now Andrew and I have comparable data for 2012 to the 2003 interviews that Pat and I used. And we've sort of divided this presentation into two parts, punditry and systematic social science. I do the punditry, and he does the systematic social science. So he'll tell you what we found, and then if we have still time, I'll come back and I'll tell you how I think it happened. But let me just give you a headline, which will be good and confusing, which is that I think Roberta McKell's iron law of oligarchy intersected with VOT's echo chamber theory to catapult marriage equality to the top of the agenda. And that really has to do with the changing nature and structure of the LGBT rights movement and with the changing nature and structure of our opposition.
Thanks, Ken. So as Ken said, we're going to be presenting and comparing results based upon the work done by Pat and Ken back in their publication 2005, which is a data set of LGBT people, and then we're going to compare that with the 2012 sample. So our research aims are going to be very much replicating what was done back in 2005. We are assessing the political knowledge of LGBT people. Do they know the current state of policy in their respective state about marriage equality? Second, priorities. So do they place a high priority on same-sex marriage? And third, we're going to look at do LGBT people favor same-sex marriage, which I think overwhelmingly, even back in Ken's 1972 data, there was an overwhelming measure of support. But then also look at the covariates and see what kind of dynamics we might be able to see in that data. So just to describe our sample, so we have the November 2003 sample. It had 748 LGBTs, and it had 663 likely voter LGBTs. Now, the reason I have to bring up the likely voter factor is that the August 2012 sample was only of likely voter LGBTs. So we're only going to be drawing comparisons between those two samples. And so if a respondent in the 2003 survey indicated they were registered to vote and that they had participated in prior elections or intend to participate in the upcoming election in 2004, then I coded them as a likely voter for this case. And every now and then I'll draw reference to Ken's 1972 data, especially when we get into priorities. So just to give a little basis for the distribution of the sample, just so that way we know what we're comparing and who we're talking about. The 2003 sample actually had a lot more gay men in the sample than the 2012 sample. But overall, we observed very little differences other than sexual orientation identification. And I do want to say that there are both surveys did ask about transgender identity. 2003, though, I think it was, do you identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? So it was in a single question. And in 2012, it was actually separated. And just to add some face validity to the 2012 sample, there were, on the priorities questions, there were opportunities to write in your own, what you think is an important political issue, and of transgender respondents, they do place a higher priority on gender reassignment therapy and coverage. And so though the identifying transgender people in surveys is still an ongoing process, we are pretty confident that we do have that subset, that part in our sample. So let's get to knowledge. So back in 2003, there were 67% of LGBT respondents who knew about the current state of policy regarding same-sex marriage, and 33% did not. And then what we observed in 2012 that this is actually vastly increased. 83% of LGBTs were able to identify that same-sex marriage is legal in their state. Now, it should be important to note that in 2003, it was actually easier to get this question right because it wasn't legal. And so in 2012, you actually have a higher benchmark because you could be in a state that does or does not. And so observing this was actually quite striking and interesting. So LGBTs are very much more knowledgeable about the current state of policy. Let's look at priorities. Now let's look at age cohorts first. Now these are tables. There's a lot going on. I just arrayed the top 5 priorities that LGBTs have, and then I also and I break this down by age cohorts. In order to draw comparable samples, I'm not looking at age groups. I'm looking at year of birth. And so we can see in 2003 that the highest priorities were on workplace discrimination, as Ken had referenced. And then we see a mix of other issues, but hate crimes generally is up there, right? And then we do see the age dynamic that Ken and Pat observed in their 2005 article, that younger generations tended to place a higher priority on same-sex marriage than older generations. In fact, the oldest generation in this list had same-sex marriage as dead last. And so we do observe this age dynamic. Now let's see what happens in 2012. We do observe still an age dynamic. So it's not that we're completely saying that Pat and Ken were, definitely they weren't wrong. There's still an age dynamic going on. But what's interesting is that same-sex marriage has crept up on the priorities of every single age cohort, and is the top priority for the youngest two. And then if we look at these priorities across different types of categories, we get even more striking sense of how important same-sex marriage has been to different subsets of the LGBT community. So if we just array this by those who identify as black versus not black, we see that in 2003, the highest priority for black LGBTs was AIDS funding, AIDS and HIV funding. And that and our non-black sample was workplace discrimination. Fast forward to 2012, same-sex marriage is the top priority for both. Now, it's also worth noting that the third highest priority among African-American LGBTs is still HIV/AIDS funding. And when you compare this to the total sample, this is actually a striking priority that is actually something that I don't think has been recognized, and I think Ken and I need to do more work on understanding why and how HIV/AIDS funding has actually become lower on the list of issues that has been prioritized. But what's also notable about the findings here is that priorities among racial groups, if you compare them, there's a lot of differences among African-American LGBTs and non-African-American LGBTs, but that in 2012, same-sex marriage, regardless of those groups, rose to the top. In 2003, here we just array it by gender, and here we see a lot of similarities across gender. Go back to 2012, we again see that same-sex marriage has risen to the top. And that what follows, of course, is workplace discrimination and hate crime. So it's not that these issues have left our consciousness, but it's just that it's not as important as same-sex marriage. And then, of course, let's array it by partisanship. It should be noted that about 66% of the sample identified as Democrats. And then in 2003, actually, there were more independents than Republicans, but in 2012, there were more Republicans than independents. So there's some variation over time going on there. So here we do see a large workplace discrimination, hate crimes, top 2 issues. Go to 2012. we have same-sex marriage as top priority among Democrats and Republicans, and the second highest priority among independents. So we do see these dynamics across a number of different categories. So now let's look at opinions on same-sex marriage. Now, one thing I have to note, and the caveat here, is that Harris Interactive, who conducted these surveys in 2003, didn't ask a more general, like, do you favor or oppose same-sex marriage in the 2003 sample. They did ask about if you were hypothetically in a relationship, right, would you want to get a marriage license? So, and we had to use that one question to try and draw these comparisons. So I do have to add this caveat about the survey. In 2012, it was much more similar to what we would normally think of as a question about your opinion on same-sex marriage. But what we have done here is that we just conducted a regression and then post-estimated the predictions from that regression. And here we're just looking at age. And what's interesting here, so keep in mind that in 2003, and we're comparing to 2012, so these age groups are about a decade apart. So if you were to compare those who are 88 in 2012, in 2003, you'd be comparing those to those who are 78 in 2012. And what's interesting here is that we see a very sharp negative effect of age in 2003, where if you were somebody who was 70 to 80, you'd likely be, it's a coin flip whether or not you'd be in favor of same-sex marriage, or at least wanting to get a marriage license. Whereas in 2012, we now observe a significant positive effect. You're more likely to want to favor same-sex marriage overall, that we no longer have this, it's a coin flip. If we start comparing the other predictors in the regression, we observe a couple different and interesting dynamics in the data. A lot of consistency, two notable shifts, and one of those, the college graduates, and the other one are those who are married and living with a partner. Now, one of the things that Ken and I know is that married and living with a partner may be that respondent LGBTs who are married or living with a partner may say that they would want to get a marriage license overall, right? But 73% of the whole sample in 2003 said that if they were in this hypothetical situation, they would want to get a marriage license. In 2008, I think 88% of our sample favored same-sex marriage. And so here, when we observe a positive effect and then the null effect in 2012 for married or living with a partner, I think that's more to do with the dynamics of the changing average LGBT voter, as much as less is so to say how much a married or living with a partner deviates from the average, right? And so, and then what we observe among the other groups, college graduates, I don't think Ken and I really picked apart what that might mean, but we do observe a lot of consistency, and that's my section.
3 minutes.
Two data points up there that I want to note, which is that we do see in 2012 very sharp differences between LGBT liberals and conservatives and LGBT Democrats and Republicans, whereas there were not sharp differences in 2003. So that as the partisan divide in national politics has sharpened on LGBT issues, it is reflected in the opinions of LGBT Democrats and Republicans. And there's not a substantial, as Pat has shown, there's not a substantial diminution in the number of LGBT Republicans between 2003 and 2012. What's happened is that LGBT Republicans have become less likely to want marriage now than they did in 2003, which tells you something about the role of political leadership and is part of my segue into echo chambers. There's another big change. Mike Signorelli was really good about this last night. We've transformed from being a protest movement 40 years ago to being a set of highly institutionalized structured interest groups today. In the old days, and as Mike talked about even with ACT UP, these were democratic organizations that had members who were citizens, who participated in making decisions, setting priorities, choosing leaders. I was kind of amused last night. We were told about how many members HRC had. It has no members. It has donors who, for the most part, do not participate in the shaping of decisions or in the choice of leadership, except for those who donate enough to be on the board of directors, who are not elected by the members. So you have a very different structure, and the structure of communication also changes. Marriage, as everybody told us last night, as Jane told us this morning, was not put on the agenda by LGBT organizations. It was forced onto their agenda by people they couldn't control. Average LGBT people who went to court to stand up for their rights, and the religious right who saw a way to seize on the issue and profit from it. This put the national organizations on the defensive. No longer could they devote their resources to advocating for a positive vision of LGBT rights. Rather, they had to defend against attacks. This diverted staff, attention, money, energy, focus, all went to marriage and away from other things like discrimination. What happens then, we argue, is a more complex argument. What happens then is that the echo chamber effect kicks in. If what you hear the leadership talking about all the time is marriage, which they have to talk about because it's what the opposition is talking about, slowly and surely the rank and file will learn that marriage is the most important thing because that's what the leadership is talking about. So you have a kind of classic echo chamber effect in which leadership determines the political priorities of rank and file, and I think that's what we're finding here.
Awesome stuff. And next up, we have Lee Badgett and Jody Herman from UCLA. Their topic today is going to be counting couples, learning about same-sex couples from state administrative data.
Sorry, no Jody, just get me. Great. Well, I also want to add my thanks to Jane and to Gary for planning this and for pulling us together. It's great to have this mix of social scientists and legal scholars in the room talking to each other. And it's fun, too, because it is a great day to be a social scientist studying LGBT people. There are many important questions that have been asked in lots of different kinds of contexts. All this work that we've been doing for years and years just because we were social scientists now turns out to be important for thinking about public policy. So it's fun to get a chance to talk to you about this project that Jody and I did and have started to try to update. And I think there may be some things that will surprise you, I hope, and maybe some things that will make you mad. That would be even better. And I'll just say this is just addition and division. That's the fanciest we get here. Because we're looking at state administrative data. So unlike the other studies that you've heard about today, which have been based on surveys, we just called up states and said, send us some data to help us answer some questions that I'll show you in just a second. But so nobody's put up a map yet of all this thing that's happened. People last night alluded to it. But you can see that there have been lots of changes. The yellow states, of course, are the marriage equality states. We tried to get data from as many of those as we could. The blue states are the civil union states or domestic partnership states. Tried to get as much data from those as we could about how many people are actually taking advantage of those different opportunities. because there are questions about this. Do LGBT people really want to get married or not? Is there a demand for marriage? How stable are these unions? And of course, are civil unions an adequate substitute? So my contention is that we can come up with some pretty good answers to all of these questions just by doing this real simple addition and division with this administrative data. So let's start with the first question, which is, what's the demand for marriage? That's Chris and Sandy. You'll meet them tonight, I guess. Are they coming tonight? Yeah. They are married. And when we counted up all of the same-sex couples who had married, when we did the study in 2011, and projected forward to the end of 2012 with the additional states that had come on board, my estimate was that about 83,000 same-sex couples have gotten married. The New York Times, in a somewhat independent count, came up with more or less the same number. My friend and colleague Gary Gates at Williams tried a survey-based estimate using a 2010 survey that found that many people reported that they had legally married. He applied that to the census figures of about 650,000 same-sex couples across the U.S., and estimated that about 114 are married. So that's actually, those aren't really that far apart. So let's call it 100,000 couples or so who have gotten married. These are only marriages. Many others have registered for civil unions and domestic partnerships. I'm not going to talk about them. But even just the married couples who've gotten married in the states where it's illegal, it's about 42% of all those same-sex couples living in those states. That's dividing, that the division there is the state administrative count, the census data count, over the state census data count. So I think it suggests there's a pretty strong demand for marriage. Turns out that it's even greater for women. So in every state, here we do have some civil union and domestic partnership states, but in every state, marriage or anything else, women are always entering those legal statuses at a higher rate than are men. And you can see that some of these situations, this isn't all of the states, but for instance, the really big bars, that's Massachusetts and marriage. By the end of 2009 or 10, I forget which, about 2/3 of same-sex couples living in Massachusetts had actually gotten married. So that's well on its way, rapidly converging with the rates for heterosexual couples. Most of these other states that have marriage here, Connecticut and Iowa, this probably has like a little, these are pointers. Connecticut and Iowa are the other marriage states, and New Hampshire here. Those have been around for much less time, so they're a lot lower. So even greater demand by women. Does that surprise anybody? No? Not at all? Not even all those lesbian feminists who said they were never going to get married, they hate marriage? Okay, oh well, all right. So that didn't surprise me. But wait, there's more. Okay, so there's the demand. So here's the stability question. So this is actually a lot harder to do because, and I didn't talk too much about states and their record keeping and their ability to pull these together in a bureaucratically efficient way. But a lot of states, none of the marriage states so far have produced any figures on divorces of same-sex couples except for one that I'll show you in just a second. But we got it as much as we could in our 2011 report. So just to give you a baseline, in any given year, about 2% of heterosexual marriages end in divorce. And so all these little bars, sort of your first impression might be, what are those really big bars? And I'll tell you about that in a second. But most of them are well below the rates for heterosexual couples. In all these different states, each color is a different state here, and you can see that most of them are below. So the big exception is this really big bar right here. That's California. In 2004, state law was about to change, I believe on January 1st, 2005, when AB 205 went into effect. That was going to give all of the rights and benefits that the state of California could give to couples in domestic partnerships. And so as part of that law, it was actually written into the law that the state had to send letters to every registered domestic partner couple in California informing them about the change in laws, because this was big. For one thing, it established that domestic partners had the right to community property. So suddenly, all bets were off, right, for some of these couples who had entered these domestic partnerships when there were maybe 6 or 7 different really minor benefits to be gained from that. So all of a sudden, right before January 1st, all of these dissolutions got filed because it was going to be a lot easier to do that then than after AB 205 went into effect. But what's interesting is we don't really know too much about those folks. So it was about 9% of people who had entered a domestic partnership. But a lot of anecdotal reports and news accounts found that actually the relationships themselves were not breaking up. They just were not willing to continue on in the new legal regime, at least without having some greater consideration. There were many tax issues that people were going to face, and it did get very complicated for people in California after that. So that's the big exception. The other ones you sort of see down here at the end. See, this is New Hampshire. You see them sort of being a little bit higher than that. So what's that about? Well, it turns out one interesting thing is somehow about 45, New Hampshire's a teeny tiny state, so 45 couples, which was about half of the people who ever dissolved their civil unions in New Hampshire, were actually had gotten those in Vermont and in other places. They hadn't actually entered them in New Hampshire, so they suddenly showed up in a New Hampshire court and they were able to dissolve them. What's interesting about New Hampshire, though, is that they are the first state that has given us information about dissolutions of marriages of same-sex couples as well as civil unions. And so looking at those as a whole from the 2003 to 2013 period, obviously this year is a little bit incomplete, but there have been 2,300, 2,400 same-sex marriages and civil unions. That's not double counting because the civil unions got converted automatically into marriages at a certain point. There have only been 177 dissolutions and divorces, so that's a 1.2% annual dissolution rate, measured very simply as numbers of dissolutions over numbers of couples going into those and then dividing it by the numbers of years. So it's not a fancy dissolution rate. So again, the first glimpse that we have about marriages suggests that these couples are very stable. Okay, so this is all from the administrative data. So now here's a question that has occupied a lot of people, which is why not just have civil unions? The kind of argument that I've made and that lots of other people have made is that you have the rights and benefits of marriage in a civil union status or some other kind of status, but what you don't get is the emotional value, the social value of the status. So you might actually expect there to be differences in demand for marriages compared to civil unions because it's more valuable to couples, and that is indeed what we find. So let me show you 3 different ways of thinking about this. The first way is to look at initial demand. In the first year that these statuses are offered, what do people do? So in the marriage states, 30% of same-sex couples living in those states got married in the first year that they could. Actually, in some cases, like in Massachusetts, it was like the first 2 months, basically. In civil union states, in contrast, or the enhanced domestic partnerships, we put them all in here, only 18% of same-sex couples are going into those statuses. And when you have the much more limited ones, where you don't get much in the way of rights and benefits, hardly anybody goes into those. So it's voting with their feet. Clearly, same-sex couples are saying they find marriage more valuable, more appealing to go into. Second way to think about this, willingness to travel. Actually, when Vermont opened up civil unions in 2000, most of the people who got civil unions were from other states. Since then, things have changed a lot, as I'll say in a second. But think about marriage and people's willingness to travel. So Iowa, right here in the middle, nowhere else in the Midwest could people go to get married. People got on buses. There were organized tours sending same-sex couples into Iowa to get married, and people came from all over. So these states show the biggest states where people came from. Texas and Florida, long way from Iowa. Most of them were from closer by, but lots of different sex couples were willing to travel to Iowa. In contrast now, unlike when Vermont was around, was the only game in town, nobody travels for civil unions anymore. Chicago basically shares a border with Indiana, so it's very easy for people from other states, and Wisconsin's not so far away. It's very easy for people to come, and yet in Cook County, where Chicago is, only a handful of people, 5% of the people in Cook County went to Cook County to get a civil union license who didn't live in Illinois. So nobody wants to travel anymore for civil unions, but lots of people are willing to travel for marriage. Now, here's the last one. Different sex couples turn out to not be very interested in civil unions either. They obviously have the option to marry in all of these states, and in some states, they have the option to go into the civil union or domestic partnership status. Sometimes it's limited to people who are 62 or over. But in an increasing number of states like Illinois and Nevada, you can actually be of any age if you're a different sex couple and get a civil union. But they are just not very interested. So here are the figures that we had from before, and I'll show you some more recent ones later. So this is from our 2011 study. So here what we're looking at are the numbers of different sex couples going into these statuses divided by the number of different sex couples who are eligible. So it might be only people over 62. And in fact, what you see is it really is, it's of most interest to people who are over 62. In Washington and California, we do see 5 to 8% of unmarried couples who are of that age group, who are different sex couples, going into those civil unions. So they're more interested, but they're not very interested, clearly. It's a very small number, whereas for same-sex couples, it was much, much higher, the 40s and 50s. More recently, we can see this in civil union in Nevada, only about not even a whole percentage point of civil unions in Illinois appear to be different sex couples. In the time that it's been offered, there have been 670 different sex couples getting civil unions in this very large state, compared to 113,000 different sex couples getting married in Illinois. Likewise, in Nevada, 1.2%, slightly higher rate, but still tiny numbers, just 1,300 different sex couples compared to 108,000 couples who are getting married. So the different sex couples are also indicating with their decision-making process that they value marriage much more than civil unions when they have the choice. So I think that question is pretty definitively answered. They're different. They're perceived as being very different by any kind of couple, and marriage is the one that people prefer. All right. So I'll just end with a couple of predictions for the post-DOMA future, which we're hoping to continue to collect data on this over time. I would predict that actually because of having federal benefits, just a simple economic incentive, would predict that more people will get married in order to get those. There was certainly many anecdotal reports that said couples didn't get married because it didn't come with federal benefits, and that's what they really needed. Now that they've got those, I think we'll see a lot of people in the marriage equality states getting married. And because many of those benefits, the tax benefits, the federal employee benefits, those things will be available to people who get married in Massachusetts but go back home to Nebraska where their marriage isn't recognized, I think we'll see lots more of that traveling happening, which is a whole other topic that I study. It will be very good for those local economies. And they're starting to vie for those people to come to their states. That we'll see lots more people traveling. I think we're going to see a very rapid increase in the number of same-sex couples who are married. And I think there will be a continued decline in interest in civil unions and domestic partner statuses. I think there'll be a very limited interest now, and we're already starting to see that kind of drop-off. So we will continue to collect that data, and hopefully we'll have something sometime next spring. Thank you.
Great, and now we're going to have Jeremy Goldman from Boyle, Schiller, and Flexner to comment on all these awesome presentations.
Jeremy, why don't you tell everybody who you are?
Yeah. Well, I got my seat at the table today as one of the lawyers who actually litigated the Perry case. I worked for Boyle, Schiller, and Flexner, and was sort of responsible for the day-to-day management of the Perry litigation and getting the case ready for trial. And I feel like the opportunity to come to an academic conference is I'm off leash for a day and really happy to be here. But you know, my what I want to talk about and what I can contribute is how this work has kind of fit into the legal work that we've been doing. And really the first thing I want to do is thank the panelists and the other people who are in this conference for doing this kind of work that really made our litigation possible. I mean, to do this kind of work, to ask questions about these kinds of issues was often not a way to make an academic career. It was hard to study LGBT issues, to do work on that, but it allowed us to put together an amazing case. And you know, there were really two themes that were the center of our litigation. The first was simply that allowing gay and lesbian individuals to marry isn't going to harm heterosexual marriage in any way. And the second the second main theme that we had was that denying gay and lesbian couples the right to marry harms them and harms the children that they're raising. So those are the two key themes. That's what we wanted to show in the trial. And Lee, of course, was one of our expert witnesses. She testified, and she helped us with both of these themes, fundamentally, with both of them. Her research on jurisdictions that have marriage equality show that no, the sky isn't going to fall on heterosexual marriage when you let gay people get married. And I can't resist as an aside that two of the proponents experts who were going to offer contrary opinions were both affiliated with McGill, and so they were actually deposed in Montreal by David Boies, and there was something delectable in the question he asked them at their depositions when he said, "Now, gay marriage is legal here, isn't it? And has been for quite some time." Because, there was something truly ironic that these were the people who were going to talk about all the bad things that would happen if you let gay people marry, and they were there in Quebec where things were proceeding quite nicely. Now, one of the proponents' arguments was that allowing same-sex couples to marry advances what they called the deinstitutionalization of marriage. That means it diminishes its meaning as a social good, makes it less special, and that way will contribute to an acceleration in the decline of marriage rates. And one thing that was notable there was Lee's finding that in jurisdictions that allow different sex couples access to marriage, only 1% of these people actually choose civil unions. So if you thought that you were really deinstitutionalizing marriage and marriage wasn't that important to people anymore, then there would be a greater willingness to enter into domestic partnerships or civil unions, but instead, overwhelmingly, people still choose marriage. Now, the deinstitutionalization argument was accompanied by the somewhat incongruous claim that Proposition 8 did not impose a second-class status on gays and lesbians because domestic partnership conferred all of the same rights and responsibilities as marriage. And I think, again, what Lee's paper does is the data show that the data belie this claim. The difference in the first-year take-up rates when you have a state that has marriage versus a state that has something else, civil union or domestic partnership, shows that these things are seen as inferior to marriage. Now, I think that continuing this work is going to be very important. We have so many cases now making their way through the pipeline. And, the proponent's lawyer, Chuck Cooper, made headlines when he famously answered Judge Walker's question about what is the harm by saying, "I don't know." But what happened was this answer was spun into a claim that it is simply too early to tell. And I think, for a long time, Lee is going to have to contend with claims that these findings simply aren't meaningful, that we don't know yet, we still can't know yet, and, the proponents would say, we can't know until we've looked at this for probably at least 2 generations, but check back with us in 50 years, and then maybe we'll have something to contribute. But, the more that we force them to ignore the data, to try to discount it and say, well, it's still too early, I think the weaker and weaker their claims look. Let me move to Ellen's presentation, and I want to talk about that sort of together with Andrew's and Ken's. Again, I want to note that the kind of research that Ellen is doing was very important to the themes of our case in Perry, and it's going to continue to be important to the other cases that are now pending in states around the country. We wanted to demonstrate both with expert testimony and with testimony by the plaintiffs themselves and other fact witnesses the very real harm that laws like Prop 8 impose on gays and lesbians, as well as the harmfulness of the campaigns themselves to enact them. And we wanted to show the benefits that marriage brings, that it does really make a difference to people's lives, because it's really harder to deny that when you can articulate what people have to forego if you deny them the right to marriage. What are the psychological economic, social benefits that attend marriage. It's very important to be able to articulate that. Now, I guess I'm not surprised by the results of Andrews and Ken's research showing that marriage equality has become a much more important issue, really across the board for LGBT people between 2003 and 2012, whereas previously anti-discrimination protections was the most important issue. And one thing that they talked about was, is this a generational shift? Is it a shift from freedom to equality? Is it a shift in the priorities of the movement elite? And so I think I just want to ask, where does this consideration fit in? And this is what happens when you let a lawyer play it being something else. But, it seems to me that 2004 was a big year. You had initiatives in a dozen states, basically the first nationwide campaign against marriage equality, and it continued in the years that followed until you basically had an initiative passed in every state where it was possible to do that. Now, one of the things that we showed in the Prop 8 trial was that what tried to paint itself as a campaign about traditional marriage was also fundamentally a campaign against gay people, sometimes subtly and sometimes not. The campaign resurrected and invoked historical tropes that were used to demonize gay people. And in that sense, it was the kind of, talking about marriage was the socially acceptable, or at least socially unacceptable way to express prejudice against gay people. Now, prior to that time, I think it's fair to say that the principal focus of the anti-gay popular initiative, there were hundreds of them, was to roll back or preclude protections against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And when I was looking at the Yes on 8 ads, preparing for trial, I also looked at the ads that were part of the Amendment 2 campaign in Colorado, or the Anita Bryant Save Your Children campaign, and it was the same kind of thing that they would use this language of no special rights, and that was the kind of socially acceptable, or at least socially unacceptable way to express the same hostility and prejudice toward gay people. And I mean, the messages were in fact coarser and more explicit than they were in the Prop 8 campaign. But the fact that each movement was serving as a vehicle, as a kind of cloak for anti-gay prejudice, wouldn't we expect that the salience of the particular issue is heightened, entirely appropriately by the recognition that when it permeates the public discourse in this way, it's not just what it claims to be. It's not just about, if you want to call it special rights, or it's not just about marriage. What it's actually doing is carrying this broader underlying prejudice. And certainly a recognition that that's going on would, I think, increase the salience of that issue. And I think that dovetails with Ellen's point about how the presence of the Marriage Restriction Amendment on the ballot created a hostile environment. And it may also play some role, some context for understanding the answers that people give now when they talk about the benefits of marriage. And so that just brings me to Pat's paper. And he mentioned several groups that have achieved de jure equality, but still, and he mentioned that they still face quite varying degrees of stigma. And my mind actually got stuck on that because there are. I think that could be significant. I wonder if it's significant. That does that help to explain in some way the trajectory that a group takes after it achieves de jure equality, the extent to which stigma still attaches toward the group? Because I think there is a very significant difference among the groups that you identified. And so I'd be interested to think about, what accounts for the degree to which stigma persists after the achievement of de jure equality, and is it possible to think meaningfully about the likely trajectory of LGBT people after the achievement of de jure equality, and how that plays out with the kind of questions you were looking at. With that, I would stop there.
Okay, I guess if the panelists want to take any time to respond to Jeremy's comments, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, or, I mean, that seems like a reasonable way to do this, but if people don't have things to say. Anyone have anything to say? Okay, well, we'll just open it up to questions. Why don't you come on back up? Yes, please. There's always room at the table for you, Alan.
Thank you. Thank you. That was an incredibly enlightening set of papers. Really, really interesting. I have a question for Pat and one for Lee. The question for Pat is, are out LGBT people, those who identify as such, much more likely to be Democrats, or are people who are more liberal more likely to identify themselves as, which directions does that run in? And then the question for Lee is, in a sense, it's not surprising that the demand for civil unions might be drying up with the availability of marriage, because they're so alike, but for the powerful social difference. Do you think there's more consumer demand, might be more consumer demand, as it were, for a form of relationship protection where people could kind of designate what they wanted to be part of their partnership, as opposed to it's everything or it's nothing? And I don't know how you would measure that, or if anything you bumped into would shed any light on that, but I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, to answer your first question, absolutely. So there is data and evidence I've written about showing that you can actually predict whether somebody is going to identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual based upon aspects of their upbringing that go way, way back. So, if we assume that sexual orientation is randomly distributed across the population, that's probably our best biological guess, right? A non-random group of people identifies as LGBT, and they tend to have better educated parents, less religious parents. They tend to have grown up in more tolerant parts of the country. And so all of those things, they tend to have fewer siblings, actually. Fewer siblings, yep. So again, coming from less traditional families, right? And those characteristics, which we're all kind of randomly assigned to. If you think about, none of us can choose how many siblings we have or what part of the country we were born, whatever. All those characteristics also influence your political views and attitudes, whether you're gay or straight, right? So educated parents tend to have liberal kids. People who are less religious tend to have liberal kids. And so because those things happen, there's what I call a selection effect, which is that a lot of people are liberal before they're gay. And so that's definitely driving a lot of the results that I showed you there today. Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah, in terms of the sort of kind of menu option sort of approach to relationships, so I don't know any place that's been tried, but I think you would run into two issues. I mean, one is the fact that you're still only addressing the obligations, rights, benefits potentially, as opposed to the more social and emotional value, which those things will just by definition not have. And at least not the rich kind of historical sort of cultural meanings of marriage anyway. The other thing that I wonder about, though, there's sort of two things, and I have a big fight with my wife about this from time to time. She thinks that we should have these 5-year renewable contracts. And then I point out to her all the bargaining power implications of that and why that might be a really bad idea. Because one thing that is good about marriage is that it sort of limits the bargaining ability, sort of how important bargaining power is on certain things. The other thing about that is that we now know from a lot of behavioral economic studies that default options matter a lot to people. And there's, this, I don't know if you guys know the book Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, but it's been very influential and suggests that you can actually make people better off by having the default option be something that you think is good for them and give them these other kinds of options, which you could sort of think of people already as having. You could do it, same-sex couples have done for centuries, for decades anyway, having wills that are very specific, having all sorts of things, that say who you want to make your healthcare decisions for you, that sort of thing. So you could kind of cobble together something like that. And so people now have that option, but they're choosing, marriage when they have that option. So I think it's very hard. The one situation that's kind of interesting that I know about, and I was telling Doug and I were talking about this yesterday, in the Netherlands, they have a very complicated kind of set of options for people. You can get married, you can get registered partnerships, and you can just live together. And if you live together, you have all sorts of, sort of rights and obligations as a result of that too. And yet, it turns out that something like 40% of same-sex of cohabiting couples, different sex couples, in the Netherlands have cohabitation contracts. So they have actually opted for that kind of approach. But when I've talked to people about why that is, what they say is it's because when you buy a house together and you go to the bank says, that's great, we'll lend you the money, but we want to know what happens when you break up, and so we want you to write that down before we will actually lend you the money. So there's another institution that's kind of shaping that default option for them. So I think, and then sort of the last bit related to the default option is that people will often not make choices when they don't have to, or they don't always make choices that, there's sort of the issue of the default and not making good choices, but there's also just, not making a decision about, whether you're going to save any money for retirement, for instance. So I suspect that people would not find those to be terribly popular. Some people would. My guess is a lot of them would have PhDs. So that's sort of my thinking about that.
I really enjoyed all these presentations. It's helpful for those of us thinking through the law stuff to have actual empirical work to tell us whether some of our impulses are right. My question's also for Pat and for Lee, but maybe Ken and Andrew also have input on this. So for Pat, I'm wondering to what extent the constellation of issues that marriage and LGBT rights has been part of influences how democratic LGBT voters might be. And so when we think of things like religious instruction in school or prayer in school or issues around reproductive rights and abortion, because the right has made those constellation of issues one, maybe that explains part of it. So to what extent do you think that when or if LGBT rights gets unhinged from that, it might change some of the affiliation? And so maybe the way in which marriage is framed also matters. So if marriage becomes synonymous with LGBT equality, we heard last night how significant it was to have Ted Olson be making a conservative case for marriage. Does that conservative case for marriage reframe thinking around the issue such that that might influence the affiliation as well? I don't know if it would. And also if religious institutions become more accepting of LGBT equality, does it change how religious institutions are interpreted by LGBT people? And then I'm just wondering from Lee, we've talked a little bit about this, what do you think the future of civil unions and domestic partnership is in the US? Are they going to disappear? Are states like Connecticut the model where they convert into marriages? And this relates to what Jane was saying. Does it matter whether there's less than the rights and benefits of marriage if one can pick up different options like designated beneficiaries in Colorado, if they're open to not just same-sex couples but also different sex couples or blood relatives, and whether that might matter? And I thought some of what Ken and Andrew was saying would actually bear on that in terms of whether there's desires for these kinds of issues and who would be the political force to preserve them. It doesn't seem from what you're saying that different sex couples are going to be.
To answer your first question, my sense is that in order for this cohesion to become unraveled, what you really need is a decline in polarization on gay issues writ large, not just between the parties, but between and among different kinds of people, So if it is, for example, it's still the case, I assume, that in certain parts of the country, girls are encouraged less to go to college than boys, right? 50 years ago, that was everywhere in the country, right? And so you can imagine like there being very different trajectories based upon where you grew up and what have you. So right now we're in a situation where the kind of family to which you're born into has a big determination of whether you, as somebody who is has a LGBT sexual orientation, ends up having that kind of identity, right? And if it's the case that religious resistance declines and prominent conservatives embrace gay issues, and the Republican Party's platform embraces this, that's where you start to see, I think, some kind of differentiation, because the process by which gay people are politically distinctive on a whole range of issues that don't have anything to do with gay rights gets unraveled, because you don't have the selection process I was talking about in terms of answering Jane's question, and you don't have the reinforcement of the two parties telling you here's what to believe on issues X, Y, and Z that don't have anything to do with you. So I think my instinct anyway is that what you really need is a very, very big unraveling of the polarization across multiple dimensions in order to get to the place where you're not seeing this kind of political distinctiveness. It could happen, we'll see, but we're pretty far away from that. So. Yeah, you guys should talk about this too. Yeah.
No, it's really about what we did in 2007. Pat and I did this study. We found first that gay people were significantly to the left on a whole range of issues, most of which had nothing to do with gay rights at all. We found that our gay sample was way to the left on say immediate withdrawal from Iraq at a time when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was in force. It was to the left on protecting the environment being more important than protecting jobs. It was less likely to believe that peace could be attained through military strength. Issue after issue after issue. It's the first thing, and that's reinforced by what Pat is finding here. The second thing we found was that there was a huge shift to the left during the coming out years. And that what we find there is that the process of coming out, I don't like to say so traumatic, but it forces you to reconsider every aspect of your identity. Everything is on the table, and it's reconsidered, and it's reconsidered in a way that moves you to the left. It may not, as Pat's saying, it may be if family, friends, religious institutions, schoolmates, and so on were all welcoming during the coming out years that some of this may not happen. Who knows? But you certainly are discovering that you're not who you were brought up to be, not someone who you grew up thinking you were, and that makes you reconsider. And my last thing here is that a good argument could be made that sort of thing happens during adolescence. So we isolated the people who came out over the age of 30, and they still shifted. The shift wasn't as dramatic, but the shift occurs there too. So there is something inherent in the process itself that moves you politically and does so in a way that lasts a lifetime.
And I think the only thing I want to add to that is that Ken and I have ongoing work on the personal importance that an LGBT person places upon that identity, and this sense of group consciousness and how that relates to this distinctiveness. And we do find that LGBT people who have higher levels of group consciousness are more likely to participate in politics, more likely to be strongly democratic, and all these other issues. And I did array the priorities based upon just levels of group consciousness, and the lowest level of group consciousness, same-sex marriage was not the top issue. So there's something to be said about how important that identity is to you, and how that permeates into your politics.
I'm very happy to answer your question, but I want to ask you guys a question related to all this first, which is that you lump together lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. And what we see over and over again is that lesbian and gay people actually are the ones who join LGBT groups. They're the ones who read LGBT newspapers. They live in LGBT neighborhoods. You know, the bisexual identity seems to mean something very different to people. So does this strengthen when you just look at lesbians and gay men?
I think, yeah, to summarize the various findings, yes. And I think a big thing that comes out of all of this work is not just separating by lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, but also by gender. That people, men and women, understand these things very differently. And as your data indicate in terms of who wants to get married, right, big difference between lesbians and gays. And so all those things need a deeper focus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, so to answer Doug's question, so let's see. So let me just kind of tell you what I know. So we see civil unions not very popular for different sex couples. Then there were these other things created both in Hawaii and in Vermont called reciprocal beneficiaries, which could be any two people who are not married and couldn't get married could have this kind of more limited sort of relationship that involved, I think, medical decision-making and some other kinds of things. And in Hawaii, so few people signed up for those that it was well under the number of same-sex couples, really well under. So I don't think that many non-same-sex couples signed up for it, but nobody's ever looked at that. In Vermont, when I was doing research for my book, When Gay People Get Married, I called them a couple of times just to kind of update this. And the first time I called, they said, well, nobody's ever signed up for that. The second time I called, they said, nobody's still ever signed up for those. So I don't think so this was like a compromise for the Republicans. It emerged out of the debate. I am extremely sympathetic to thinking hard about how to, honor and give some meaning in a legal sense to other kinds of relationships. But my takeaway is we don't know what people want. So I think it's a question that requires probably some research into, what people are looking for, what might be possible. The Canadians have thought more about this than we have, I think, but. For cohabiting couples, just for instance, it's very complicated. A lot of them go on to get married, and they know they're sort of on that track. So at least half of them or so, I think. So, so they aren't necessarily going to be interested in something besides marriage, and many of the others end relatively quickly, and so they're not necessarily interested in something other than that. The Europeans kind of have cobbled, the Scandinavians in particular, have cobbled together these legal rights and obligations for cohabiting couples very carefully, to preserve autonomy, to prevent gaming of social benefit systems, to recognize the weak bargaining power of partners in certain situations. So they've thought a lot about it in ways that I don't think we have gotten to yet.
I actually have two different questions, one for Ellen and Sharon, and one for Ken and Andrew and maybe Pat, given his participation in the earlier wave. So for Ellen and Sharon, I totally buy your findings. I think they're extremely important. There's an extensive literature, as I understand it, on the effects of marriage on straight people, on everyone, in terms of life expectancy, health outcomes, financial stability, et cetera. And I'm wondering if your sense is that the benefits of marriage in terms of less depressive episodes, happiness, life satisfaction, are about the same for gay people, somewhat bigger, somewhat smaller. Do you have a comparative sense? And I'll ask the other question, and then I'll sit down, and you can both answer. The question to the guys is, what the hell happened to AIDS? Like, when you were looking at your issue priorities, AIDS is gone, except that AIDS isn't gone. So I'd like to hear your reaction to that. Except for blacks, but even as you looked across cohorts of males, in the 2012 study, AIDS did not appear in the top 5, except for that one subcategory.
And it went down what?
And it went, so, wow.
The answer is AIDS is not gone because AIDS is gone. The answer is that we are losing control of the spread of the disease because people are less worried about it. And why are people less worried about it? It's not talked about as much.
I think it's also, I mean, in some way, the blackening of AIDS might have something to do about it, right? So as AIDS, it's sort of become a black issue, both in terms of populations that are being heavily affected by it, but also potentially in terms of sort of its political salience. And so it's possible, one reading could be that as AIDS has become black, it follows a trend of what happens when political issues become black. So as welfare gets blackened, we see what happens to it on the political agenda as well. And so perhaps maybe what's going on with HIV might be the same. But that's just speculation.
No, I think it's. I mean, yeah. I think there's a cohort story too. So I think a lot of people in later generations don't know people who've died of AIDS, for example. And also, it's a story that it's not a death sentence. So, given the choice between, and I think also when people hear AIDS funding, they're not necessarily connecting it to AIDS drugs, which is really what you need to survive AIDS now, right? And so the people don't think you need AIDS funding for like care or case management or all those other things that AIDS funding actually pays for. We desperately need. It's more if they think if you can get the drugs and get a prescription, then you're fine. And so I think that might also be part of the story too, is that they don't see it as a matter of funding, but more as a matter of just access to these drugs. More speculation.
On the happier side here. Yes and no is the answer to your question. Yes, our findings are consistent with those for studying marriage in heterosexual couples. No, in the sense that we don't know yet. As I was pointing out, some of these indicators are indicators that are really, I call them trait-like because they're more consistent, and so it's going to be harder to measure changes. It's going to be stress has an impact on physical health as well as mental health. It's going to take a long time to see changes in minority stress. Somebody brought up that just because we have marriage equality does not mean that this chronic minority stress is going to go away, because stigmatization will still be there in a lot of cases. And so we're going to see a gradual change over time in some of the more trait-like measures like health outcomes. Behaviors and symptoms, on the other hand, as I was pointing out, that can change more immediately in an acute sense. Whether or not somebody is more likely to go to the doctor because they are married, that can change quicker. But those long-term health outcomes, for instance, will take a longer time to change. And the impact of stigma is still there, and so chronic minority stress is still here. So the answer, yes and no.
I had a question.
Very academic.
I do my best.
A follow-up question for you and Sharon, maybe about your research. So one of the things I really liked about it was this notion of sort of the magic in the word, right? But I'm also a disenchanted social scientist, so I would struggle with this notion of magic. So I'm wondering, though, if there are certain sort of opening the black box of what's happening in sort of marriage relationships versus super committed, practically married but not married, versus cohabitating versus dating versus single. And so part of me thinks that, it could be this external structural thing, but then you would expect differences depending on if you were a married person who was in a state that recognized that marriage versus a married person in a state that didn't, but you don't see much of that. And so I'm wondering if it's internal practices within type of relationships, right? So do married people do different things compared to people who are in very, very committed relationships, practically married, but not actually married? And maybe those different practices are what's driving the sort of different sort of emotional outcomes, right? So you can imagine, just think about it, when you're dating someone, once you move to being exclusive, the relationship is sort of different internally, and then it becomes different internally when you move in together. And is there sort of a final frontier of marriage? These sort of like the practices of marriage that
Marriage, the final frontier.
Yeah.
That's my next talk now.
Yeah.
Right.
And then I guess this follow-up is, would you expect to see the flip, negative effects? So a divorce versus a breakup, right? So like if you have to get legally divorced versus breaking up, does the divorce take a greater toll on your emotional well-being? So just,
okay.
Sorry.
We aren't there yet.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm going to be totally academic again and give two answers. Yes, no. No, I am going to give two answers. One is that we are involved in a study with Esther Rothblum and Kimberly Balsam that is a long-term longitudinal study of couples who got civil unions in 2001, 2002 in Vermont. And then now they've had they did a follow-up in 2004, I think it was, but now we're doing a follow-up that's, 10, 11, 12 years later, and we'll be able to see marriage as an intervention. And a lot of the measures that they originally had showed that same-sex couples do things differently in a relationship and did things somewhat differently in a civil union. Now we'll be able to look, okay, what does it look like when, because many of these couples have subsequently gotten married or had their civil union converted. And so we'll be able to look at that. So in other words, wait, ask me again in a year. And some of it is we just don't know yet. I mean, I think from the interviews that we do, and one of the things that we've studied is commitment in same-sex couples, and we've looked at that in a variety of frameworks. And Sherry, please remind me if I'm forgetting part of an answer here. From a variety of theoretical frameworks, and same-sex couples in committed relationships do tend to visualize that in very similar ways to different sex couples in a relationship. But there are also some important differences. A lot of it's around equality in a relationship. Just the lack of sex roles in a relationship causes people to communicate in a different way. And so I think the construction of relationships for same-sex partners is different. And I think that that's something, though, that's only going to play out over time. It's going to be hard to see now. It's going to be easier to see a little later. So ask me again, Nate.
So it was very interesting to hear what everybody had to say. And since I'm in a position where I am largely unencumbered by data or by the ability or desire to collect it, I want to toss out a bunch of questions that I'd be happy to hear anybody address. And actually, this one wasn't on my list, but you raised it, Ellen, so I want to ask this one too, which is a lot of the debate about marriage early on, especially within the feminist communities, was would having same-sex couples marry change the nature of marriage? Not just and around sex roles, around destabilizing gender roles or sex roles for different sex couples. So I think that would be a very interesting thing to study. I would like to know the answer to that question. And I mean, that's really not what you're talking about here, but it is a question that was a serious one, right? What impact really would same-sex couples' marriages have on different sex couples, not in the sense of devaluing their marriages, but changing the allocation of responsibility. But my question's really based on the presentations. Well, let me just tick some off. One was about temporality and its effect on identity, meaning I wonder, gay issues have been in the news in one way or another for 20 years. And that is if we don't count the early coverage of AIDS as a gay issue. And so I wonder, sort of projecting out ahead, say if we are all living in Massachusetts and gay issues are not so salient in the news, what sort of impact that is likely to have on identity formation. And I agree very much with Ken that regardless of news, right, the process of coming out requires a kind of identity formation and reformulation that will always be there because, family lines don't tend to organize along sexual orientation, and it is a minority identity. But that was one question for me. And a second question was, you all talked about the impact of, well, in different ways, the impact of marriage on identity and preferences. I wondered also, what is the difference when rather than being named in marriage or gaining access to marriage, the legal shift is in being named in an anti-discrimination law. My guess is that has quite a different impact on identity and is quite a different effect even on vocabulary than being granted access to marriage. And I was thinking particularly of the discussion you mentioned, Ellen, about the second graders. I mean, most people do not define their identities at that age by their being named in an anti-discrimination law, but marriage, which is about personal relationships, is something that people get. So I'll stop there.
Some of the impact of same-sex couples getting married on sex.
Well, yeah. I mean, as Jeremy was saying, I mean, you don't really see any change in their kind of the big baseline measures, But so what's happening internally is, I think, what you're talking about. I'll say this. So certainly a lot of the couples I interviewed in the Netherlands said the feminist, lesbian feminists in particular, use that argument to help themselves feel better about deciding to get married, basically, because they, they had maybe some prior resistance to it, sometimes somewhat consciously related to the inequality they had experienced. Like, I don't want to be a member of a club that won't have me. But then once the club's doors were open, then they had to decide. And so sometimes that was a way, I think, for them to rationalize something that might have been more of a romantic impulse or other kind of impulse, to say the way to change marriage is to let two women get married, basically, in the words of one couple I interviewed. So I think, so there definitely is, the lesbian feminists, have that intention in mind. Now the question is, can they actually achieve that? And my, kind of glib answer is always, gay people aren't going to change marriage, heterosexual people already did. And, so to the extent that we see big changes in what heterosexual couples do, much more, women are much more involved in the labor force. That's a huge change from, kind of traditional marriage, so-called traditional marriage, where the man is the breadwinner and the woman is the stay-at-home parent. So there's already been big changes. Will it change the allocation of labor in the household? That's a harder question to ask, I think. So just if you want to read something provocative about this, so it's kind of well thought out to a certain extent, I would recommend Liza Mundy's article in The Atlantic back in May or June. And she, kind of looked at all the academic research that showed more egalitarianism in same-sex couples and in child rearing, and to a certain extent maybe in other kinds of things, and said, oh, what a great model same-sex couples are, isn't this great? And so she found a couple of places where, like, there's the guy who's the dean of the National Cathedral now, uses what he's learned about how same-sex couples are better at, dealing with conflict, and he, kind of uses that in his counseling of different sex couples before they get married, stuff like that. So there may be, so people have found a couple of things that they think, might be useful lessons for different sex couples. Again, translating that into changes in behavior is a whole other thing in and of itself, which I am personally dubious that will be what will change heterosexual people's organization of labor. There's a lot of other things that would make a bigger difference, like having paid family leave, things like that I think would make a much bigger difference in this particular policy intervention. But actually, there's something I was thinking about one of your other questions, though. What happens when gay issues aren't salient in the news? I think that's a really interesting question. And like in the Netherlands, so like, the Netherlands has been Massachusetts for longer than Massachusetts has been Massachusetts. So, and so one of the guys I interviewed there plans big events for gay people. And so that's his business. And so he said, people are always telling me everything's fine now, everything's equal. Why do we need, events for gay people? And it's like, well, there's just one really basic thing that you can never get rid of. You've got to find other people who are like you to form relationships with, to have sex with, whatever it is that you're looking for there. And I think that from just an economic transactions cost perspective, you could like really reduce search costs if you have an identity and and you have organizations, you have bars and restaurants where people congregate. There will always be a demand for that, I think, just for that kind of most basic of human purposes. So I think there's always going to be some functionality of identities, even in a world where we have de jure equality. So that's just my economistic perspective on it.
There's some interesting, some research on this question. A sociologist, Japonica Sarantino Brown, on lesbian enclaves. And what she finds is that people move to lesbian enclaves expecting this like strong sense of lesbian community, and often newcomers are really disappointed, and they get there and they're like, actually, there's not much of a sense of lesbian community.
That would be Northampton in Massachusetts.
Yeah, I think that it's potentially one of her field sites, actually. But what she finds is like the mechanism sort of delivering that is you move to a lesbian enclave, and everyone's like, we don't care that you're lesbian. And so you can be a part of our regular softball league. You don't have to join the lesbian one. Or like,
there are lesbian teams in those softball leagues. I can tell you that. I mean, there's definitely, even within those kinds of contexts.
Yeah, and so she finds that, as they're in context, like geographic context, which sort of map onto political context, right, where there's this sort of pure sense of a stronger sense of acceptance and embracing, right, where there's sort of a shoulder shrug to your lesbianism. That people are integrated into other communities, and so there is sort of a lowered salience of lesbian identity, but she also finds that this absence produces a sense of longing, and sort of pain is too strong of a word, but so there's this sort of a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, right? The sort of identity becomes less salient, but that lack of salience actually produces a sense of frustration and anxiety among lesbians.
Well, one more thing about the salience of identity. So I'm forgetting the author, but there's a very prominent piece in Sociology that looks at the growth of American Indian identification from 1960 through, I think, 2000. And this is just using census data, right? So like the American Indian population grows by like 1,000% during this period. Now, that's clearly not all new people being born into American Indian communities. It's the idea that this identity has become probably A, more salient, and B, less stigmatized, right? And I think that model actually is something that I think is what we're seeing with these data, which is that the identity is more salient and it's less stigmatized, which leads more people to decide that they are that and going forward. And so what's interesting is when the salience drops out, right, but the lack of stigma also continues the stigmatization continues to fall. It may be that those two things will cancel each other out and we'll still have a high sense of identity. I don't know. But that's a process that I think might be quite parallel to what we're seeing here.
I mean, so I think there's also a parallel in that there's an accessibility to the category. So part of the reason Native American explodes is because sort of white people are saying, oh, I got a little bit of Cherokee in me.
Yeah,
like, right. Because having a little bit of Cherokee in you is now all of a sudden sort of acceptable like way of being othered. It's a way of sort of garnering status, right? And sort of, it's a cool thing to be. Perhaps not unlike sort of having a little bit of gay in you. Is becoming an increasingly sort of acceptable.
Especially in Massachusetts. I mean, it's
right, exactly. And like sort of Native American identity, it's tough to police, right? So it's hard to police who's Native American and who isn't. It's similarly hard to police who's gay and who's not. Like you could say, oh yeah, I'm a little gay.
Like when Ken Melman came out, I thought we should have a vote. So I'm going to have to play time cop, but there's two more questions.
Yeah.
So we get them through. If Dara and Tom could ask their questions, then we'll let the group respond.
Great.
Let's ask both questions, and then we'll let the group respond.
Okay, I think this will be short. First, two very quick comments for Lee. One, I'll validate your question about being surprised by the fact that women were so much more likely to get married, both from sort of feminist perspective, but also based on my very thorough scrutiny of the New York Times vows section each weekend for same-sex couples, in which my casual, I don't want to ruin my Sundays, maybe other people do this too, by taking notes, but it looks to me like in that high status place, same-sex male couples are much more likely to be featured. I'll also just note, if you haven't seen it already, that or didn't notice this summer that the Minneapolis mayor, R.T. Ryback, was running around the upper Midwest states that don't yet have real legal marriage, encouraging same-sex couples to come to Minneapolis and get married and spend money. The quick question, and I hope I'm not making a mountain out of a molehill here, but for Ken and Andrew, I thought I noticed in 2003, but then not later, that what was the word used, the term used? Federal benefits were sort of a high priority, or getting equal benefits from the federal government, and that too kind of fell away. And in some ways that makes sense if marriage becomes the priority. But if this was a forced choice question, I think it was, right? They were given that option. Is that?
Yeah. They had opportunities to write in, and so and some people did write in. They would label, like in 2012, same-sex marriage was important, and then they'd also say repeal DOMA in a write-in. So there's something about federal benefits that gets tapped into in some of those options.
Okay, but it kind of falls away, and I just wonder if there's something to be sort of plumbed there in terms of what this means about the prioritization of same-sex marriage, displacing something that people think of as a turn to the state for benefits. And I don't want to sort of throw around terminology, but if there's something kind of privatizing and neoliberalizing, even at the same time as the federal benefits themselves are sort of constrained by marriage. But I just think there might be something interesting to look at there.
Yeah.
This is for Lee mostly. So the numbers you're saying show that when you have same-sex marriage, maybe civil unions as well, people don't suddenly opposite-sex couples don't suddenly fail to understand what marriage is about and drop away from it. What about the converse argument that was made that civil unions, call it a conservative argument for gay marriage, a sort of Jonathan Rauch argument or something like that, that legitimizing civil unions as the route for this one group of people will sort of delegitimize marriage, or at least cut away at marriage. It sounds like what you're finding is that there's no evidence of that either. Is that true? Should that argument not be employed in defense of, it's an argument for gay marriage, that kind of argument? So what's your comment on that?
Yeah. Gets a little sort of the point Jeremy was making in a way, I guess. I don't think, so as I said, if you're a couple, a different sex couple living together, I guess the thing that you would worry about, the thing that would create evidence that there's some problem with having civil unions is that instead of getting married, they get a civil union. But if it's just instead of living together without anything, without any legal status, then it seems to me that there's no competition in that sense with marriage. But it's an interesting thing. I mean, some of the people on the other side of the marriage debate have said, look at civil unions and registered partnerships and all the things that different sex couples are doing, like in the Netherlands, getting these flash divorces, and this is terrible, this is a bad thing. So in the Netherlands, it's easier to get out of a registered partnership than a marriage. So what some people were doing when they were married and wanted to get a divorce was they converted their marriage to a registered partnership and then got out of it more easily. So they call those flash divorces. And so people have pointed to that and said, this is a bad thing. But that doesn't have anything to do with gay marriage per se. That's about a political compromise that created this other kind of institution that then became open and sort of siphoned some people off. So I guess I'm a little skeptical about there's anything that we can really draw in terms of conclusions about deinstitutionalization from what we see in the civil unions for different sex couples.
I wanted to say something in response to Darren. There's a possibility that by 2012 it was about love. I'm very serious. That by 2012, the national dialogue, in large case, thanks to the Prop 8 case, had begun to focus on people love one another and want to get married because they love one another. And I think when people opted for marriage as a priority, it was for that reason. I'll give you, another kind of anecdote. After the terrible New York Court of Appeals decision, there was a rally in Sheridan Square, and I saw these 20-something boys saying, "Now I'm never going to be able to get married." I mean, and it was pure emotion. And I think that's why federal benefits dropped off the list.
Which isn't at odds with what I'm suggesting.
No, I'm just saying,
They're not thinking about
marriage isn't always
right
right.
from the state right away.
Yeah.
So I'm going to offer a comment, and then I'm going to conduct some business, and then we'll have lunch. My comment is just simply that I think the data that we see from Lee, particularly as we look at the civil unions versus marriage take rate, suggests that two sort of opposing myths may not, in fact, ever come to pass. Opposing myth number one is that gays and lesbians in principle wanted marriage, but that in practicality, many gays and lesbians themselves did not wish to enter the institution. And I actually kind of believe that. I thought, wow, lots of people who would describe their partnership as a marriage would then recoil when actually given the opportunity to put up or shut up. Or maybe I'm just describing my own life, whatever, but unfortunately not. But then, so that doesn't appear to be the case. And then the other thing is, as our student protesters have alluded to, there's the more radical critique of marriage, that it's an institution that's inherently exploitative, and it gives the state power over human relations, and we should be opposed to that. And that doesn't appear to really have a lot of traction either. I mean, there's an intellectual argument for it, but marriage appears to be like French fries. It may not be good for you, but nearly everyone likes them. And so I found that fascinating. I have a little bit of business to transact, which is I have to confirm tomorrow's limo departure. So, Will Baud, you're scheduled to leave tomorrow morning, and the limo is going to come at 6:45, not 6 o'clock. I'm sure that'll be a happy news to you. Tony, 5 p.m. Doug, it's going to be 6:30, not 6:15. 6:30, pick up. Paisley and Suzanne, you're both scheduled to leave at 8:45, and if it's okay with you, we'll just bring your luggage to Jane's, and we'll have the limo company pick you up from Jane's house. Is that okay? And then Andrew, I need to confirm a detail with you, and that's it. And so we should have lunch. Thank you guys for a great presentation.